Because actually, it's more the before and after that matters rather than the war in itself.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a military specialist, but and so that's the Chinese side, and you can see we spent a lot of money, we put a lot of effort in, but then there are these certain things that that would lead to its problem. And then on the Japanese side, and again I can't claim to be a Japanese specialist, but from my understanding is that the Japanese then went on the Meiji. Japan was in the Tokugawa shogunate from 1603 onwards, and was pretty much very stable up until 1854 when the American Navy, Matthew Perry, went into Japan and signed a series of these treaties. That's actually the story of Madame Butterfly. Yeah, so that's when the Japanese realized that we can't do this, that we have to modernize. And one thing led to another. There was a revolution against the shogunate, and then some of the lower level samurais actually took over the government and created a cohesive Japanese empire with the emperor as the figurehead and a constitutional monarchy. And what's interesting about the Japanese versus the Chinese story is, apart from the demographics or the size of population or population density, what's interesting is that the Chinese system was ironically fairer. As in, anybody, as long as you go to the exams and you actually pass the exams, you can actually be as high up as the prime minister. Anybody can do that. Just like anybody can be Mark Zuckerberg, but there's like the possibility that it could happen. In Japan, it's not. Unless, if you are a high-level samurai, you and your son and all your descendants will always be a high-level samurai. If you are a peasant, you'll always be a peasant. And so it's very much a very medieval European country. So when the West came to China, the resistance against reform is very high because everybody might get a piece of the action. But Japan, actually, the resistance is very low because a lot of people are very disgruntled, especially the low-level samurais. That's why they took over the central government so quickly. And so when they took over the government, they went to the path of modernization. And the Japanese path of modernization was complete, it was total, and it was very sincere. And also, they also created a lot of these shiratsu, like the big companies, well, like the Mitsubishis, the Mitsuis, like the government would build a factory and they would sell it back to modern to private hands, and then private hands would then run it very well, and that's how they grow. And which contrasts to China, well, the last time I talked about it in the modernization period, all the modern companies like shipping or whatever, they're actually all basically government departments, and state-owned enterprises are never run as efficiently. And so the Japanese, then they realized when they invaded Taiwan in 1874, or when they were trying to exert more control on Korea, which was a vassal state of China, they realized that the Japanese must build a great fleet. And but then the Meiji emperor said, "Let's build a great fleet." The government says there's not money, and then the Meiji emperor said, "You know what? From now on, I'll donate. I'll put in all my money." So he put in 300 yen, which is actually more than now. 300,000 yen. It's about 200,000 taels of silver. He would stop eating one meal a day, so he only eat one meal a day until they beat the Qing Dynasty. The empress would donate all of her jewelry and use, I don't know, sakura to decorate herself or something. So when the emperor does it, everybody was in. And so within 3 months, they actually got about 700,000 taels of silver. So you contrast that with China, and then you've got whoever could donate, they would donate, and then this is an extreme case where young girls would donate their virginity. And they sell the virginity and then use the money to buy the national debt that would go into the procurement of the Navy. And we look at it as
buying war bonds or something.
the buying war bonds, yeah. So it's like just like in the 40s, early 40s, right? So in 1888, the total tonnage of the Japanese fleet was about 40,000. So contrast to 70,000 in Beiyang. And then by 1894, they spent all this money, they got all the way up to 62,000. And the 62,000 is much better than Beiyang's 70,000 because they developed later. So they bought the ships later, and the ships are faster. So in general, the Chinese fleet goes around, the fastest ones go about 18 knots. But because of heavy usage, it goes down 15. The newest ones that the Japanese have bought is at 23, especially the one called Yoshino. Yoshino is they was actually built to design for Li Hongzhang, for China. China did, all the money went into the Summer Palace, so they couldn't buy it. The Chinese couldn't buy it, so the Japanese bought it. And that turned out to be the one ship that it's going to cause most of the damage to the Chinese fleet. So Japan, we're talking about, so it's really, 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 it's a one-track mind to get it done. So you can see the big contrast. And now let's talk about what actually caused the war. And what caused the war was Korea. Korea, for many, many, many years, in the Ming and Qing Dynasty, was a vassal state of China. So a vassal state is something like China would not exert control on the country. So we're not you give gifts to China every year, and you don't have your own independent foreign policy. And you don't have and then when there's a case of need, China will come to your rescue. So that's the vessel. You can say it's a little bit like a one country, two systems kind of thing. It's like foreign policy and defense. And so, but then after 1840, there was a bunch of people who rightly observed that China is on decline in Korea. And then so, we can't just be with China when China is like they lost the first Opium War, the second Opium War, right? So there were a bunch of people with the support of the Japanese that say we must modernize like the Japanese. And so the Japanese actually signed a treaty with Korea, which is like those other unequal treaties between Japan and Korea. And so they created two major forces in the Korean political scene. One side they would side with China. The other side would side with the world, and with Japan as the number one. This is the Japanese side of the story, which is Korea. Like when they had sent the army to Korea, part of the purpose is actually to modernize all of Asia, and so in 10 years before 1894, in 1884. There was this rebellion from the Korean king became emperor, became king very, very young. And so his father was the Prince Regent. And so when the king got older, the power had to go back to him. But he was a very weak character. And so all the power went to his wife, concubine Min. M-I and Min, right? So the father-in-law and daughter-in-law do not get along. So these are the two sides. The father-in-law tried to create the king of the father of the king decided to have a rebellion that was swiftly put down by the Chinese army, kidnapped him, took him back to China and released him after a while. So from then on, the Min side of the power struggle, the daughter-in-law was fully in control. And because the Qing government had given so much support to Min was firmly on the Chinese side. And there was a bunch of people that were for modernization that was on the Japanese side. You just be very simplistic about it. In 1894, there was a half religious, half peasant revolt called 东学党. 东学 is east school. I think it's a province in Korea. Would you know the name? 东学? Yeah. So the founder of the religion was like, we are not going to go with Christianity or Confucianism. We're going to go with ourselves. And every day you just memorize these 13 verses, and you will have peace and peace and prosperity. And so they basically, it's a bit like the Boxer Rebellion or Taiping Rebellion. It's always, if you want to mobilize peasants, you don't talk about Socrates and Aristotle. You go with superstition. And so it always works like a charm, no pun intended. And so and so there was a huge following, and they actually invaded all the way to Seoul. And when they invaded Seoul, in 1884, when that thing happened with the rebellion, the Japanese has always wanted a hand into domestic Korean affairs, and so when 1880 there was a negotiation between Li Hongzhang and the then Prime Minister of Japan, Hirobumi, talking about Korea. And so what the conclusion was, if Korea had with something going on, both countries can send the army to put the revolt down. So that was the background in 1884. And so in 1984, when 1894, when that happened, both the Chinese and the Japanese were thinking about sending the army, their respective armies, to put down the rebellion. The rebellion was swiftly put down by the Chinese, but the Japanese actually sent troops into Japan, into Korea already, and would not back down. Again, this is very firmly on the Chinese side of the story, just as a disclaimer. The Chinese was like, no, the rebellion is done, go. And the Japanese like, no. Like, in order to not to have this thing to happen again, our respective armies must stay in Korea to ensure that there's modernization in the country, which obviously is the Japanese side of the story. The Chinese would have none of that. And so both armies were they're not fighting yet, but they were both in Korea. And the Japanese already, I mean, it was the whole point was to invade Korea, then China. And so at the point, in the beginning, actually, in Korea, there was already 8,000 troops, Japanese troops. In China, we did not want to fight. We just want to, so there was only about 1,500. And then none of the Qing troops were actually in Seoul, just in case there would be any kind of conflict. So most of the Qing troops were actually in a place called Yashan. It's like Tooth Mountain, to avoid conflict. And it was and then as the situation escalated, China, there were actually two sides. The Empress Dowager did not want to fight. It's her 60th birthday, so she doesn't want any kind of bad stuff going on. Guangxu, the emperor, he was 24, so he was he was bloodthirsty. He's like a young guy, so he wanted to fight. And so when the two sides were actually they have not decided yet, the conclusion was that the army had no idea what to do in Korea, so they did not take the strategic places in Seoul, and so Seoul was actually took over by the Japanese. And so as they were sending troops up to Korea, China was still deciding whether to fight or not. In July the 25th, Li Hongzhang tried to hire a British fleet, a ship, like just a civilian ship. And there were about 2,000 Qing soldiers and about 200,000 taels of silver to Korea. And then there were 2 or 3 of the Beiyang fleet protecting these soldiers, these army. The Japanese fleet, that was about the 5 to 6 ships, there was a tonnage of about 3 times that the Chinese had on the thing, came and started attacking. And when they started attacking, the British, the Japanese demanded that the Chinese would surrender. The Chinese would not, so they got the little boats and got the non-Chinese individuals, the captains, the British captains, away, and they started fighting. One of the main battleships in the Chinese side left because they couldn't handle the Japanese fleet. The civilian boat with the soldiers then sunk. And then there were about 1,000 soldiers that were in the water. The Japanese shot all of them, so the whole water was actually red. It wasn't until there were a British ship that took the survivors away. But what's interesting was the China and Japan were not at war yet. So the Japanese invaded or attacked the Chinese fleet before there was any announcement, a declaration of war. And the Japanese did it again in 1904 on the Russians, and it worked. And that's why they tried to do it again in 1941 to the Americans. And obviously, like LeBron James, the third time did not work. And so that was the trigger point for total war declaration. And then you could see the Chinese were actually extremely ill. Both sides. After this incident in Fengdao, the war began. And the war began. And you read the documents of the Emperor's edict on why to fight the war. You know that the Chinese were not prepared. the Japanese side was like, this is for the glory of the empire and also for the peace and prosperity of Asia. In China, the Chinese side is the cunning nature of the Japanese was not predicted. So you can tell. And so when they were fighting, obviously Seoul was already in the hands of the Japanese. The Japanese then hit head on with the Chinese soldiers. We're talking about 1,500 on both sides. 15,000 on both sides.